The National Archives of Terravane hold census records dating back to 1888, documenting every citizen enumerated in the nation's 17 provinces. The records before that year do not exist, not lost in a fire, not damaged by flood. They were never transferred to the archives at all. According to official documentation, the 1888 census was the first comprehensive national enumeration ever conducted in Terravane, and no systematic population records existed before that date. Except that is not quite true. I found evidence while researching inheritance disputes from the 1870s. Legal cases required proof of family lineage, and attorneys repeatedly cited census verification in their arguments. Court records from 1874, 1876, and 1881 reference census data used to establish residency, age, and family relationships. The records describe census enumerators, household schedules, and provincial compilation reports. These weren't vague references. They were specific citations to enumeration years, district numbers, and page locations within provincial census archives. But when I tried to access those archives, they didn't exist. The provincial census records referenced in court documents from the 1870s and early 1880s are not in any archive. No municipal storage, no historical society collection, no government repository. The documents that multiple legal cases relied upon have no physical trace. The official explanation appears in administrative histories of Terravane statistical bureaus. It states that prior to 1888, population enumeration was conducted locally and inconsistently. Some provinces attempted census counts, but the efforts were poorly organized, incompletely documented, and never centralized. The 1888 census was the first coordinated national effort, conducted under the newly established Bureau of National Statistics, which standardized methodology and created permanent archival records. Reasonable, logical. Except for the court cases that cited those non-existent provincial records as established documentary evidence. Here is what strikes me about the timing. The Bureau of National Statistics was created by statute on the 15th of January 1887. Its founding mandate was to conduct a comprehensive national census and establish permanent record-keeping protocols. The first national census began on the 1st of March, 1888, and was completed by November of that year. The Bureau's first annual report, published in January 1889, describes the 1888 census as the inaugural enumeration of the Terravane population. But I found budget records from the provincial governments dating to the 1860s and 1870s. Multiple provinces allocated funds for decennial census operations. The allocations appear in 1860, 1870, and 1880. The budget line items specify expenditures for enumerator wages, form printing, and data compilation. The 1870 census budget for Meriden Province totaled 6,200 marks. The 1880 census budget was 7,100 marks. Money was allocated, enumerators were presumably paid, forms were printed. But no census records from those years survive. I searched for the enumerators themselves. Provincial employment records from 1880 list temporary workers hired for population enumeration duties. I found 43 names across 3 provinces. The employment period was listed as March through June 1880. The records note that workers were paid from the provincial census allocation. I tried to trace what those 43 enumerators collected. The employment records don't specify. The provincial archives contain no census schedules from 1880, no summary reports, no population tallies, just the evidence that enumerators were hired and paid to collect data that has left no documentary trace. Now here is where the timing becomes difficult to explain. I found a directive from the Terravane Council of Provinces dated the 12th of November, 1886, 2 months before the Bureau of National Statistics was established. The directive ordered all provincial governments to transfer their census records to a central repository in preparation for the creation of a national statistical office. The directive specifically mentioned records from the 1860, 1870, and 1880 enumerations. The directive acknowledged that previous censuses existed. It ordered their centralization. Then 2 months later, the Bureau was created, and its mandate described the 1888 census as the first. I requested access to the records of the transfer process mentioned in the 1886 directive. The National Archives has no documentation of census records being received from provincial governments in 1886 or 1887. No transfer receipts, no inventory lists, no acknowledgement that anything was delivered. The provinces were ordered to transfer records. The order implied those records existed, but there is no evidence they were ever sent, and no evidence they were ever received. But here's the detail that doesn't fit. I found correspondence between the director of the newly created Bureau of National Statistics and the provincial governor of Western Province, dated February 1887. The bureau director, a man named Callum North, wrote to request access to Western's previous census records for the purpose of methodological review and comparative analysis. The provincial governor responded that Western census records from 1870 and 1880 had been transferred to the central repository as directed in November 1886. The records were no longer in provincial custody, but the central repository has no record of receiving them. I searched for other correspondence between North and provincial governors. I found similar exchanges with 5 other provinces. In each case, North requested access to previous census records. In each case, the provincial governors stated the records had been transferred to central storage per the November directive and were no longer accessible at the provincial level. 6 provinces confirmed they had sent their census records to the central repository. The central repository has no documentation of receiving anything. I tried to find Callum North's personal papers. He served as director of the Bureau of National Statistics from 1887 until his death in 1903. His professional correspondence should be in the Bureau's archives. I found letters he wrote about budget requests, staffing decisions, and methodological debates, but I found no further correspondence about the pre-1888 census records after the exchanges in early 1887. He asked about them, the provinces said they'd been transferred. Then he apparently never mentioned them again. Here is what bothers me most. I found the 1888 census enumeration instructions distributed to field workers. The instructions include a section on how to handle households that had been enumerated in previous local counts. The instructions state if household members indicate they were previously counted in a provincial census, note this in the remarks column, but conduct full enumeration as if no prior record exists. The instructions acknowledged that previous censuses had occurred. They directed enumerators to note when households had been previously counted. But the enumeration was to proceed as though those prior counts were irrelevant. I searched the 1888 census schedules for remarks about previous enumeration. The schedules are preserved in the National Archives. I examined records from 3 provinces. In the remarks columns, I found 17 notations similar to Household State's previous enumeration 1880 or head of household reports being counted in prior census. The enumerators documented that households remembered being counted before, but those prior counts don't exist in any archive. I found one more document that I haven't been able to explain. It is a memo dated December 1887 from Bureau Director Callum North to the Chief Archivist of the National Archives. The memo reads, "Confirming our discussion, census records transferred from provincial custody will be retained in restricted storage pending review of archival classification protocols. Access limited to Bureau personnel until further notice." The memo confirms that census records were transferred. It states they were placed in restricted storage. It limits access pending classification review. I requested information about restricted storage protocols in 1887. The National Archives has no documentation of restricted census storage. No classification review. No records of Bureau personnel accessing restricted materials. The memo describes a storage arrangement that left no administrative trace. The current census records in the National Archives begin in 1888, complete, organized, and publicly accessible. Before 1888, there is nothing. Court records from the 1870s reference census data that doesn't exist. Provincial budgets funded enumerations that produce no surviving documentation. Governors confirmed transferring records to a repository that has no record of receiving them. A bureau director requested access to records, was told they'd been centralized, then wrote a memo about restricted storage that created no administrative trail. And the 1888 census instructions acknowledged that previous enumerations had occurred while simultaneously treating them as if they had never happened. I tried to trace individual families backward from the 1888 census. The 1888 records include fields for age and birthplace. A person listed as age 45 in 1888 would have been 25 in 1868, 35 in 1878. If provincial censuses occurred in 1870 and 1880, those individuals should appear in those records. I selected 50 households from the 1888 census whose members' ages indicated they would have been adults during the 1870 and 1880 enumerations. All 50 households include remarks indicating they were established residents, not recent arrivals. Many had been in the same location for decades. Those 50 households, containing approximately 200 individuals who would have been innumerable adults in 1870 and 1880, have no documentary existence before 1888. No census records, no voter registrations that might have served similar purposes, no tax rolls that enumerated household members. They appear in the documentary record, fully formed in 1888, with no prior paper trail. The official narrative is that before 1888, systematic population enumeration didn't exist in Terravane. Local, inconsistent efforts occurred, but left no reliable records. The 1888 census was the first professional, comprehensive, permanent enumeration. But court cases cited census verification from the 1870s. Provincial budgets funded decennial enumerations in 1860, 1870, and 1880. Enumerators were hired and paid. Governors confirmed transferring completed records to a central repository. A bureau director wrote about restricted storage, and the 1888 census instructions told enumerators how to handle households that had been previously counted. The records existed. Evidence points to their collection, their transfer, their centralization. Then they vanished, not through fire or flood or administrative neglect, through something more deliberate. Something that left a memo about restricted storage, but no restricted storage documentation. Something that prompted census instructions to acknowledge prior counts while treating them as irrelevant. Your ancestors who lived in Terravane before 1888 were almost certainly counted in provincial censuses. The censuses happened. The budgets prove it. The enumerators were paid. The governors confirmed the records existed. Those records are gone, not lost, gone. And the National Archives insists they never existed in the first place. The 1888 census schedules sit in climate, controlled storage, documenting everyone enumerated that year. Complete, permanent. The foundation of all genealogical research in Terravane. Before 1888, there is only absence, funded, confirmed, referenced, documented absence, waiting for someone to explain where the names went.